Hey there, this is Mrs. Tolleson with your review for our upcoming test on fossil record, geologic history of Earth, and evolutionary history and relationships. As always, it's a good idea to have some paper and a pen or a pencil nearby so you can take some notes, sketch out some diagrams, write down any questions you might have after watching the video, and then you can come and ask me. We've gone over all of this information in class. A few things we haven't gone over yet, but we are going to go over those before we have the test, but you can always start reviewing now. And again, feel free to pause at any time when you're watching the video. Go back, rewatch certain sections, and let me know if you have any questions. So the student wonderings, these come from STEM scopes. Kind of questions that guide each of the units. And for fossil record, one of the questions was, how do we know that today's animals are similar to and also different from the animals of the past? So what is there in the fossil record that we can look at and see that shows us similarities and differences between early animals and today's animals? For geologic history of Earth, one of the big questions is, are all fossils about the same age? And again, these are guiding questions that start off the unit, and then hopefully we, kind of discover some answers to these questions along the way. Evolutionary history and relationships. What is the scientific evidence that supports human history in the periods before we had written records? So, there's only been written history of what has transpired on Earth for a relatively brief period of time, considering how long the Earth has been around. So there's a lot of scientific evidence that scientists rely on to help them to understand what went on before there were these written records. So some of the learning objectives, again, for the fossil record, it's the learning objective or performance expectation is that the student is expected to analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the following things. The existence of, the diversity in, the extinction of, and the change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth, under the assumption that natural laws operate today as in the past. So that statement that natural laws operate today as in the past just covers these ideas that our understandings of how the world works today, we have to assume that that's the way the world has always worked. If we find hardened lava in a location, we find igneous rock, that's evidence that a volcano erupted. We know that's what happens today. So if we find evidence of igneous rock from millions of years ago, we can assume that there was a volcanic eruption. We know there are earthquakes today. There were earthquakes in the past. We understand how wind and water can erode rocks, and we assume that the same thing was true in the past. So we have to make these assumptions that these, the way that these laws of nature work today is the way they have always worked. For geologic history of Earth, the student is expected to construct a scientific explanation based on evidence from rock strata or rock layers for how the geologic time scale is used to organize Earth's 4.6 billion year history. And again, we're going to get into all of this in more detail as we go through this presentation, but these are just the objectives that at the end of each of these sections of this overall larger unit that we've covered these ideas. And for evolutionary history and relationships, you'll be expected to apply scientific ideas in order to construct an explanation for the anatomical similarities and differences. And anatomy is just, the physical appearance, how these organisms are put together. So we're talking about similarities and differences in anatomy among modern organisms, so organisms that are alive today, as well as between modern organisms or organisms that are alive today and fossil organisms from many millions of years ago, to infer evolutionary relationships, to kind of show common ancestry. Can we look at the anatomy and see how these living things are related to each other? So we started off with fossil record, Kind of the tying theme for all these three units that are part of this larger unit is all about talking about connections between things as they were in the past and things they are today, to show kind of the history of Earth, how things have changed, how they've stayed the same, how environments have changed over time, and how organisms have changed in order to survive in these changing environments. So when we started off the fossil record unit, there was an image of a fossil, and you were trying to decide which of these statements, which of these 7 statements, was most accurate with regards to fossils. And the 3 that are colored here after we've gone through the unit, we can go back and say that these are the most accurate. So we know that fossils tell us a lot about how life forms have changed over time. That when you look at rock layers, the youngest fossils will be found on top or in the topmost layer of rock. And that the fossil record provides evidence of the history of Earth. So some of our vocabulary for fossil record, we talk a lot about putting things in chronological order. And chronological order is just when you arrange things in the order that they occurred, like making a timeline. You're talking about what happened first, second, third, fourth, etc. So the fossil record helps scientists put the events, the organisms, and things that happened in Earth's history in order. Fossils, when we talk about fossils, we're talking about the preserved remains of organisms or their imprints that show how these long dead organisms lived and how their bodies were structured. A lot of times when we think of fossils, we think of what's shown here in this picture, kind of an imprint of a fish, some bones, some teeth, claws, but some of the other things that can be considered fossils are imprints, like footprints, the burrows that different animals have made that have solidified in the rock, seeds, eggs from dinosaurs. There's many, many different things that can be considered to be fossils. An insect trapped in amber, a woolly mammoth trapped in ice. All of these are fossils. The fossil record is what we call, it includes all of the fossils that have been found, along with the rock layers in which they are found in their order of appearance on Earth. So when we talk about the fossil record, it's kind of a catalog of all of these different fossils, indicating the rock layers that they were found in, which gives scientists an idea of how old they are, at what time period were these organisms alive. And an important thing to note, to understand, is that the fossil record is incomplete. It does not include every organism that ever lived, because not everything that dies makes a fossil. The conditions have to be just right in order for fossils to form. Fossils are mostly formed from the hard parts of organisms, so things that did not have hard parts, like some of the earliest organisms that were either single-celled or made of soft body parts, it was much less likely for those to leave fossils. So we have far fewer fossils of those earlier organisms that did not have the hard parts to them. Sedimentary layers are just layers of rock that are deposited on top of one another, and we can distinguish them, or we can tell them apart because they have different mineral contents and they look different. In these images, like from the Grand Canyon on the left, you can see the different colored stripes of rock, and they're different colors because at the times those rock layers were formed, the types of minerals that were in the atmosphere and in the water, in the air, added to the sediments and provided those different elements to give different colors to the rocks at that time. Most of the fossils that we find are found in these layers of sedimentary rock, because sedimentary rock forms one layer at a time, stacking one on top of the other. So when an organism dies, it gets buried underneath layers. So these sedimentary rock layers are where most of our fossils will be found. Extinction is when a species no longer exists. It's the process of a species going out of existence. When something, when an organism there's no more members of that organism alive on Earth, it's considered to be extinct. Once something is extinct, it can never come back. It's gone for good. Common ancestry. This is is when organisms are descended from or they share a single ancestor. And what we're looking at here is a picture of a cladogram or phylogenetic tree, which we'll look at more later on. But there is evidence in the fossil record and other types of evidence that we'll talk about going forward that indicates or proves that the relationship between living things, that there is common ancestry, and we can tell when we look at certain aspects or certain characteristics of organisms, we can see how closely related they are. And when I say close relationship, I'm not talking about how you're closely related to your brother or sister or aunt or uncle or a cousin. It's not that close of a relationship. It's just human beings are more closely related to some organisms than others. This idea of diversity or biodiversity, it describes the variety of different species of organisms as well as the variety within each species. So the first part, there's many different types of organisms. We're talking about the prefix bio on biodiversity means just living things. So biodiversity is technically the term for the variety of living things on Earth. If you look at this picture here, it shows a variety of many different types of organisms. There's many different kind of fish, there's coral, there's many different types of living things in this picture. But also within a single species, within human beings, or dogs or cats or whatever, there's a lot of variety as well. Not all members of a single species look the same, so there can be a lot of variety between organisms, different types of organisms, and even within the same species. Radioactive dating is a way that scientists determine the age of rocks and fossils. It's just, you don't have to understand exactly how it happens, but some elements are radioactive, meaning that they break down over time. So scientists can use this information, and there's a technique that they perform to analyze the amounts of these chemicals that are in the rock or these elements, and that can tell them how old the rock is. So when scientists use radioactive dating, they can give you an age range. Say it's from 100 to 200 million years old, or it's less than 5 million years old. So they can assign a number to the age of the rock. And relative dating, it's not shown there. We'll talk about it in a minute as another kind of dating, which just tells you if something is younger or older than something else when you look at the rock layers. So how can the fossil record give us clues about the climate and habitats and how they've changed over time? So when scientists look at these fossils that they find in rocks, it can give clues to the past. Was the habitat or the climate in this area the same as it is now, or did it used to be different? So we know that plants and animals that are alive today have adapted to their climates and habitats, meaning that they have certain abilities, or their bodies are adapted, or the way they deal with certain situations, it has allowed them to survive in whatever their climate is. If they can't survive in that climate, then they go extinct. But plants and animals have certain adaptations to survive wherever they are. And again, we know the same is true for the past. These laws of nature apply now, and they apply in the past. So when we find fossils, they can give us clues about the environment in the past, when the organism lived there. For example, if you find a fish fossil in the desert, this is evidence that long ago there was once a body of water there. We know fish live in watery environments. Fish don't live in the desert. So if we find a fish fossil in the desert, that provides evidence that in some time in the past, when that fish lived there, there was water there. If the environment changes too much or too quickly and the organism cannot adapt to it, then that organism will vanish from the fossil record. It will go extinct. So if a scientist is looking at layers of rocks and all of a sudden, they're moving up through the layers, so they're moving from the past up towards the present, and they all of a sudden a certain type of organism, they no longer find those fossils in the rock layers, that's evidence that that organism went extinct for some reason. What patterns do we notice when we look at the fossil record? One of the activities we did, do number one, where you took all the Jenga blocks and you put them in order from oldest to youngest, and you kind of looked at what types of plants and animals were alive during these different time periods. We noticed some certain trends or certain patterns that the earliest animals, on this image here, earliest animals down here at the bottom, um, were simple creatures, and they lived mostly in the water. Okay, they had soft bodies, they were relatively small organisms, and then as you move up through the layers, you can notice as time goes on the organisms get more complex. They're not as simple. They're larger bodies, they have more different kind of parts to them, and as time went on, also as we move from bottom to top, the organisms move from being not only in the water to being land animals, animals that can fly in the air, so a larger variety of plants and animals as you move from the past to the present. There's a little point to ponder, a little funny thing that I showed in class in case you missed it. If oil is made from decomposed dinosaurs and plastic is made from oil, plastic is a petroleum-based product, are plastic dinosaurs made from real dinosaurs? And in some ways, they are. So different types of fossil formation. We did an activity called Forming Fossils, where you went through the stations and kind of did a simulation of different types of fossil formations. And one of the first one was imprints, where we pressed a leaf and a shell in between two pieces of clay, and that simulates this type of fossil where organisms are pressed between layers of rock. It leaves behind an impression or an imprint of the organism, kind of like an outline. The organism isn't there anymore, but you can see the outline, you can make out details of what the organism looked like. Petrification or permineralization is the station where we had the little sponge and it soaked up the blue water, and you could see that the water went from being in the petri dish into the sponge. This same type of thing happens with sometimes organisms die and they're buried in sediment. The soft parts decay, and over time water seeps into the bones, and the minerals that are in the water replace the hard parts, eventually turning it into a stone version of the original bone or organism. And the third type, preservation, where we had our little pebble that we covered with dish soap, is when animals can be encased in something, whether it's amber or ice or peat bog or tar pits, and this dramatically slows down the decay process, so the fossils can form. And in these instances, a lot of times you can find complete organisms, like when an insect gets trapped in amber. We saw some images. I showed you an image of a little woolly mammoth that had been trapped in ice. So sometimes you can get whole organisms that are very well preserved in this method of fossil formation. A peat bog, just in case you missed it this day when we discussed that, a peat bog is it's kind of a marshy, swampy area. It's a wetland that accumulates peat, which is dead plants. They fall in to this kind of, you start off with a open water lake. It's got plants all around the edge. Over time, the plants die. They fall into this lake. You can see the lake's getting smaller and shallower, and now we've got some plants growing up from the bottom. Eventually, over, again, long periods of time, it says you've got this swampy center, and what can happen is animals can walk across, and it essentially, they just kind of get stuck in this kind of muck that's here and sink in and can be preserved. Rock layers, when they're formed, they obviously start at the bottom. So an organism that's down here will die. It lays on the ground. It gets covered in sediment, forms a layer. The next organism that comes along, however many hundreds or thousands of years later, that can die, gets buried in a new layer, and so on and so forth. And this process keeps continuing over time, and layer upon layer upon layer of rock builds up. So as a plant or animal dies, the sediments pile up, and over long periods of time, we're talking about hundreds, thousands, even millions of years, all of this material packs down over time and turns into rock. We're talking about very long periods of time. And stratigraphy, or relative age dating, is a general way of talking about how old a rock layer is. It doesn't tell you how many years old. It cannot tell you in millions of years old how old something is. You can only use the rock layers to tell whether something is older or younger than something else. So we know that the youngest or newest fossil layers are in this top layer, the oldest fossils are in the bottom layer. So when I look at these layers here, I can say this fish is older than both this lizard and this puma, or whatever kind of animal it is. I can say this lizard is younger than the fish and older than the puma. I can say the puma is younger than both of them. All of those are correct ways of labeling these fossils. When we're talking about relative age, you're just saying it's older or younger than something else based on where it's positioned in the rock. And the law of superposition says as long as rock layers are not disturbed, for example, by an earthquake, they haven't been shaken up, the youngest layer is always going to be on the top, the oldest layer is always going to be on the bottom. Each layer is younger than the one beneath it and older than the one above it. And the layers are always put down horizontally, straight across, like this. Here's an example of disturbed rock layers. There's a fault line right here, a crack in the earth. And you can see that on either side, these rock layers aren't lined up anymore. So if we took this side and shifted it up, then this layer would line up again with this would line up with this would line up with this, and it would be back the way it originally was when those rock layers formed. They form in horizontal layers. So if you see something like this, you know that the layers formed and then this fault happened. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then again, this is just another image of absolute age dating, radiometric dating, radioactive dating. This gives a more specific age to the object or rock because scientists know how long it takes for these radioactive elements to break down. They have a half-life, and scientists use that information to determine and give an age to the rock layers. So moving on from fossil record to geologic history of Earth. Some of the words we added on here, and again, there's a lot of overlap between fossil record and geologic history. Geologic time scale, it just describes the timing and relationship of events that have occurred during Earth's history, and we're able to put them in order by relating them back to stratigraphy, or the study of rock layers. So we're comparing rock layers to time and putting things in order in Earth's history based on the rocks. Geology is the study of rocks. And we looked at today in class, today, not everybody was there, but we looked at the geologic time scale drawn to scale, the big paper one, and it kind of showed how much time on Earth has really had not very complex living things. The vast majority of the time on Earth had very simple organisms. Rock strata is just another name for rock layer. It's a bed or layer of sedimentary rock that has approximately the same composition throughout. So it means it's made up of the same type of material. So when you look at rock layers, you can kind of tell, like you saw that picture earlier of the Grand Canyon, you can really tell where one layer ends and another layer begins because they look different. They're made up of different material. Index fossils are fossils of particular organisms that existed for only a short period of time in Earth's history, and they're used by scientists to identify a geologic period. For example, trilobites are an index fossil. Whenever scientists find trilobites in a layer of rock, they know exactly the age of that rock. That's been determined that trilobites only lived for a specific period of time. Index fossils are important for scientists to help them kind of match up layers when they're looking at layers of rock from widely scattered areas across the world. And then the law of superposition, which we saw just a minute ago, just says that rock layers are laid down horizontally, stacked on top of each other, with the older layers laid down first, so they're on the bottom, and the younger layers on top. So this is an image of geologic time scale. I know, we used it a minute ago in fossil record, but geologic time scale, it kind of takes into account these periods of time here, millions of years ago. So here's current time, down here 650 million years ago, and it assigns, there's different eras, eras, and within the eras there's periods, and they're kind of marked by these different events. So geologic time, or the time in Earth's history, has been broken down into these sections, and it's based on kind of events and the types of plants and animals that were alive during those specific times. And the fossil evidence found in these different layers helps to determine kind of the rock layers' ages, and radioactive dating is used, and all of that information is put together to kind of create this profile of the history of Earth by studying rocks. And if you look at this picture over here, again, you can tell the different rock layers or strata apart because they look different. They're made of different types of sediments. So you can very clearly see that this is a layer, and here's a layer, and another layer, and another layer. So each of those different colored layers represents a different period of time in Earth's history. Not all layers are the same thicknesses. Not all periods of time in the geologic time scale are equivalent. Not all of these periods cover the same amount of time. So the law of superposition just says that when a sediment is laid down, it's laid down horizontally, like in this picture right here, in layers. The oldest layers on the bottom and the youngest on the top. As long as the layers haven't been disturbed, we can say that this is the youngest, this is the oldest. But sometimes there's an earthquake, the layers tilt, tectonic plates, which we'll talk about later, push against each other and kind of squish together, causing folding, making mountains. And now these layers, it's a little bit hard to tell the order that they're supposed to be in, what the original order was in. So if we notice that the layers are tilted like this, we know that something has happened. Some force has caused these layers to get out of order. And when that happens, scientists have to use this law of superposition, that they know that sediments are laid down horizontally. They can start looking for evidence of fossils in the layers that can help them kind of put these layers back in order. So geologists use the law of superposition, to determine the order of events. This is the image, we used this in class when we were talking about what was the order of events that happened in this location. We used this exact picture. And in this image, the order that you should have had, and that we went over in class, the order of events in this location was that the first thing that happened was layer C was laid down. The second thing that happened was layer B. Then layer A was formed. So the three rock layers, C, B, then A. Next thing to happen was layer D. This is, or not layer, this part D here is called an intrusion. That's where magma from down below here, outside of our picture, pushed up through the rock layers towards the surface. The last thing that happened was E. E is a fault line, so there was an earthquake. So layer C formed, then B, then A. They were stacked right nicely right on top of each other. D pushed through them. Then at some point in Earth's history, there was an earthquake. And you can see that if we could take this side and slide it up here, we could line up B with B and D with D, and there should be underneath here, you would expect to see more of layer C to match up. And then if you look, if you slide it up, the two sides of layer A are not going to line up anymore. And that's because probably at the time when this fault happened, one side was higher than the other, but over time erosion kind of evened out this top surface. So you should be able to interpret a diagram like this and explain your answer. Fossils can be used to correlate rock layers that are found in different locations. What does that mean? Correlation means you're trying to show a relationship or a connection between things, and in this case, you're trying to show a relationship between rock layers. If scientists find rock layers that are made of the same type of material and contain the same type of fossils, then they can infer that those layers formed at the same time. This is helpful when studying rock layers that are in different continents or if erosion has happened. So we can look here at locations 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we look here where this arrow is pointing, the composition of these 3 layers is the same and the types of fossils found in there are the same. So even though they don't line up perfectly, that's evidence that they're the same layer. The same could be said for this layer here, this one, and this one. Those would all have formed at the same time. And again, here we've got another picture where there's some kind of erosion has happened and the layers aren't perfectly lined up anymore. But scientists use evidence both on the material of the rock layer itself as well as the fossils that are in there to kind of match up those layers. Index fossils are a special type of fossil because they can help scientists quickly determine the age of a rock layer. Specific index fossils are found in specific periods of time. There are many different index fossils. Trilobite is one of the more popular ones that everybody seems to know about and that we've talked about a little bit in class. In order to be an index fossil, the following things must be true. The organism had to have existed for a relatively short time in Earth's history. Not that it had a short lifespan, but that in the history of Earth, it existed for a relatively short period of time. The organism had to be abundant, meaning there was a lot of them. It wasn't just a few. And the organism was widely distributed. It was found in all parts of the world. In order to be an index fossil, it has to meet all those 3 criteria. So in the diagram below, these 4 outcroppings or 4 rock locations, examine the rock layers from these 4 different places around the world. Which fossil would be an index fossil and why? Why don't you, if you need to pause the video for a second, think about that. Because there could be a question like this on the test. So look at the requirements for a index fossil. Okay, and like we talked about in class, and actually I guess it doesn't say it on the slide, is that index fossils are found, again, in a specific rock layer, okay, and they aren't going to be found in any other rock layer. So they need to be abundant, there needs to be multiple of them, and they are found in a very specific layer of rock. They're not found all over the place. So why don't you pause for a second? I'll give you the answer in a minute. Okay, hopefully you paused and try to figure out the answer. So the answer to this question, the one that would be an index fossil would be D. It would be this one here. You've got 4 of them in this one layer. I can look around and see they're not found in any other layer. Okay, this organism here is found in this layer, but it's also found in this layer. Okay, this stick thing, it's hard to see what it is. It's kind of a blurry picture. It's only here. There's only one of them. You need to have multiple of them. Okay, this one, you have multiple of them in this layer, but it's also found in this layer and this layer, so it doesn't qualify. The only one that would be an index fossil is this shell right here, because there's multiple of them in the single layer, and it's not found in any other layer. It's in this specific short period of time in Earth's history. Okay, so lastly, evolutionary history and relationships. This is more talking about comparing different living things and talking about how they're related to each other. So when we talk about evolutionary history, we're talking about we have to look at the anatomy of the organism. It's where we study the structure of the animals and their parts. Sometimes we're going to use the word anatomical. It just means relating to body structure. If we're talking about anatomical similarities, we're talking about similarities in body structure. Homologous structures are something, a structure or a part that is similar in position, structure, or evolutionary origin. There's several different ones we'll talk about, and these homologous structures, this prefix homo means the same, these similar structures support the idea of common ancestry between organisms, that they share a common ancestor. They have something in common, and that common ancestor could be millions and millions and millions and millions of years in the past, but it's still a common ancestor. Evolutionary history is talking about the sequence of heritable or inherited changes that occur among species since the origin of life on Earth. So it's a history of living things, but it's how these changes are inherited and passed on from ancestors to future generations. And a species is just a group of similar organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So humans are a species. You have different species of, you have dogs, you have cats, you have, sharks, whales, all different kinds of species. The thing that makes it a species, and we don't really get into a big discussion of that, is they have to be able to mate and produce fertile offspring. A cat and a dog are not of the same species because they cannot mate and produce offspring. A cladogram or phylogenetic tree, it's a tool or a diagram that shows the relationships between organisms, and it helps show which organisms are more closely related to each other. So when you look at a cladogram, these branches, the closer together these branches are, the more closely related an organism is. The farther apart they are, the less related they are. And along the way, you can see kind of what the next development is that separates one branch from the next. So here it says these are all vertebrae. Mean that the appearance of vertebrae is that all organisms from here on out are going to have vertebrae in their spines. They have a spine. Then a bony skeleton. So everything from here up has a bony skeleton. Everything from here down doesn't. 4 limbs. Everything from here up has 4 limbs. Everything from here down does not. And so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about that in class. Additional important terms to know that come up in this discussion of evolutionary history is that a vertebrate versus an invertebrate. A vertebrate is any animal that has a backbone. Okay? And if it doesn't have a backbone, it's called an invertebrate. It does not have a vertebrae. Adaptations are just the changes in behavior or structure or function of the parts of the organism or their physiology that allow them to be more suited to their environment. Okay? Things that need to swim in the ocean usually have some kind of flippers or fins. That's an adaptation. They would not do well if they had wings. Things that need to walk on the land need to have some kind of legs. Something that needs to fly needs wings. If something needs to hunt for food, it has to have predatory behavior. So adaptations are, and you'll talk more about adaptations, I believe, in the 7th grade, but just a general idea that these are some kind of change that an organism has to have. It allows it to be successful in its environment. And a limb is an arm, a leg, a wing, a flipper of an animal. Okay. For example, this image here shows 4 different limbs. In addition to the fossil record, scientists also look at homologous structures to see if organisms share a common ancestor. So the human arm and the leg of a cat and the flipper of a whale and the wing of a bat are all considered to be homologous structures because there are similarities in the bone structure. And that indicates that at some time in the far distant past, the bat, the whale, the cat, and the human all shared a common ancestor. There are 3 main categories of homologous structures. We can talk about anatomical homologies, where we're looking for similarities between the bones and the skeleton. What do they look like? Are there physical similarities in the way the skeletons look and the way the bones are arranged? There can be developmental homologies or developmental homologous structures, is when scientists look at what organisms look like before birth, when organisms are in their embryonic stages. Do they look similar? If so, that's proof of a common ancestor. We can look for molecular homologies, similarities in the DNA and the genes of an organism. The more the DNA has in common, the more closely related the organisms are in evolutionary history. So when we look for anatomical similarities or anatomical homologies, we're looking for similarities in the bones and the forelimbs of, like, for example, mammals, reptiles, and birds. If we look at these, we've got several different organisms here. We've got the wing of a pterodactyl, the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a dolphin, the flipper of a seal, the leg of a dog, the leg of a sheep, the arm of a human, the arm of a shrew, which is a small type of rodent, I think. I'm pretty sure that's what it is, a shrew. Looks kind of like a mouse, sort of. Um, if you look, and it's kind of color coded here, all these orange bones, they're all the humerus. Each of these arms has a humerus. Now, the size of the humerus might be different. Some are shorter, some are longer, some are thinner, some are thicker, but it's positioned the same. This is a point of attachment to the rest of the body. And then there's a radius and an ulna. The bones of what would be the forearm of your arm are kind of the lower part of the leg of the dog. It's here, kind of as between the humerus and what looks like a hand, but is really the flipper of the dolphin. And again, what would look like our fingers on the pterodactyl, on the bird, and the bat are kind of hidden or covered up by the skin that makes their wings. So all of these, when you look at the bone structure, you can see that there's a lot of similarities. And here where it says different selection pressures, it's just they got the same bones, but they're arranged different ways because they need to do different things. These animals need to fly, these need to swim, these need to run, these need to be able to grab onto things with their fingers. So the way the limb looks is different on the outside based on what the organism needs to do with it. But if you could look underneath, if you can look at the skeleton, you can see the similarities. Now, you got to remember the word similar doesn't mean the same. They're not identical, they're similarities. They look, you can tell that they have something in common even though they're not exactly the same. Sometimes when we're also looking for physical similarities, we're looking kind of just like the overall appearance of something. Like for example, a large skeleton, tusks, and a trunk. These are similarities between the modern day Asian and African elephants, and the extinct woolly mammoth. You can look at these and kind of just tell that there's got to be some kind of connection between them because they look so similar. Developmental or embryological similarities, when scientists look at embryos and they can see a similarity, it indicates that there is some common ancestry. So if we look at these, the very earliest stages of embryo development here across, these all look pretty similar. If we look down here at the bottom, we can tell that this first one here, this is a fish, this is a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. So this is the very earliest stages of embryo development, and a little further along you can start to see that things are starting to look significantly different here. And then in this last stage here of embryo development, you can really see a big difference between the different types of organisms. They're starting to look more like what they're going to look like as their final animals once they are born. Okay, but the closer related things are like hogs, calves, rabbits, and humans. Calf is a baby cow. These all look more similar to each other. Like the hog and the calf look pretty similar. The closer things are related to each other, the more similar they're going to look. And the third piece of third homologous structure, the third thing that scientists look at to determine how closely related organisms are, is to actually look at their DNA. This is the relatively newer way to compare because DNA testing is relatively new. When scientists can compare the DNA or the genes of organisms, and the more the DNA of two species have in common, the more closely they're related. So if scientists look at the DNA of a chimpanzee and a human being, and this is kind of a representation of what that looks like, each of these little bands on here, on these chromosomes, represent different genes. The more similarities they can kind of match up, one from the chimp and one from the human, the more closely they are related. And this is showing a human and a mouse. So human and chimpanzee DNA is about 98% the same. So there's a lot that we have in common with chimpanzees. So they are in the evolutionary scheme of things, they are a relatively close relation to us. Again, not like your cousin, but in the grand scheme of things, evolutionarily a close relationship. All DNA shows some similarity between all living things because all DNA is made up of the same components, the same chemicals, no matter what the organism is. So there's going to be some similarity between all DNA, but the more it has in common, the more closely related the organisms are. So, which two of these animals do you think are most closely related? Scientists were pretty surprised to find out that the elephant and the elephant shrew are actually more closely related, a little bit more closely related, than the elephant shrew and the mouse. So there's more DNA in common between the elephant and the elephant shrew than the elephant shrew and the mouse. So even though these are more closely related in size and they look more similar to each other, on the molecular level, when we look at DNA, the elephant shrew and the elephant are actually have a slightly closer relationship. When we're talking about homologous structures, just because two structures look similar, it does not mean that the organisms share a common ancestor. So that you can't just go by that. Sometimes organisms have similarities because they live in the same type of environment. So they need to be able to do some of the same activities in order to survive and thrive. So just because two things have wings does not mean they have a common ancestor. So when we're talking about homologous structures, they have to have similar anatomy, meaning the same type of bones arranged in the same way. But they do different functions. Like the picture we looked at before, you can have a leg for walking, a wing for flying, a flipper for swimming, a hand for grasping. Homologous structures are always going to develop in animals that are related, that they share a common ancestor. So if we look at something and we see all of these things, the anatomy is similar, but they do different functions, they develop in animals that are related, those are homologous. Sometimes structures are analogous, meaning when we can look underneath, we can look at the anatomy, how it's put together, they're put together differently. They do similar functions, so analogous structures for flying, like the wing of an insect, the wing of a bird. This should say the wing of a bat. I have wing of a bird twice. Sorry, it's a typo. So all different kinds of wings. They develop in animals that are not related. They're not inherited from a common ancestor. Okay, so just because two animals have wings does not mean they have a common ancestor. You have to look at the anatomy. Okay, if they have similar anatomy, then there could be a common ancestor. For example, these are homologous tetrapod limbs. Tetrapod means it's coming from something with 4 limbs. There's a similar number and type of bones. They're arranged in a similar way, but they have different functions for grasping, swimming, flying, walking, etc. These are evidence of a common ancestor. The anatomy is similar, they're arranged in a similar way, they have different functions, they're evidence of a common ancestor. These are examples of analogous structures, all of these wings. Okay? All of these wings, they do not have the same anatomy if you look at them. They are not, they do the same function. They're all for flying. It does not mean they have a common ancestor. Okay? And here it says, and it can be a little confusing, bird and bat wings, they're analogous as wings. They did not inherit, birds and bats did not inherit wings from a common ancestor with wings. What they did inherit is forelimbs, these front limbs. They inherited front limbs, and eventually those front limbs adapted or became wings because both birds and bats needed to fly. Okay, so they didn't inherit wings from a common ancestor. They inherited forelimbs or front limbs that eventually adapted into wings. You're not going to be asked to get into that big of a detail, but the question comes up often, so I wanted to explain that. And this is the last slide. I showed it in class. Sometimes scientists get it wrong. The coelacanth was a fish that was long thought to be extinct. It was thought to have gone extinct 65 million years ago when dinosaurs went extinct because scientists had not seen it. It lives in deep ocean waters, usually deeper than a couple thousand feet. Rare to be seen, but in 1938 a fisherman caught one in a net and scientists realized they were wrong. It was not extinct. And one of the things they did notice is that the modern day coelacanth looks very similar to the coelacanth that they have the fossil of. And this is an indication that not too much has changed in the environment of the coelacanth over long periods of time. When organisms will only adapt or change if they have to, if their environment changes. If something doesn't have to change, it's not going to. So if an organism looks the same now as it always has, that's an indication that that organism has not been exposed to a very dramatic change in their environment over time. So I know this is a longer video than I think I've ever done before. Please feel free to watch it again. If I said something that was confusing to you, please come talk to me about it. If you have any questions, come see me. Please study for the test. Thank you.